The dust hung heavy in the afternoon air, coating everything in Willow Creek with a fine layer of grit that seemed to seep into the very soul of the place. It was 1880, and the small frontier town sat like a weathered jewel against the backdrop of purple mountains that rose in jagged peaks toward the endless sky. The wind swept through the dried grass with a mournful whistle, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain that would never quite reach this parched corner of the territory. Margaret Sullivan stood on the wooden porch of her modest cabin, one hand shading her eyes as she watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. At 26, she was young to be a widow, though such circumstances were hardly uncommon in these harsh lands. Her husband Thomas had been dead for nearly 2 years now, taken by pneumonia during a particularly brutal winter that had claimed many souls. Since then she'd managed to scrape by, selling milk from her 2 cows and bread she baked in the early morning hours before the heat became unbearable. The cabin sat on the outskirts of town, far enough away that she could avoid most of the townspeople's scrutinizing gazes, but close enough that she could still conduct her meager business. It was a delicate balance she'd learned to maintain, visible enough to survive, invisible enough to avoid becoming the subject of too much gossip. A young widow alone was always a target for speculation, and Margaret had learned to armor herself with distance and propriety. She adjusted her worn cotton dress. The fabric faded from countless washings, and prepared to make her weekly trip into town for supplies. The general store would be busy this time of day, which meant enduring the sideways glances of the other women and the too bold stares of some of the men. She steeled herself for it as she did every week, lifting her chin with a dignity that had become both shield and weapon. The town itself was typical of frontier settlements, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to appear more substantial than they were. The Silver Dollar Saloon anchored one end, its batwing doors constantly swinging as cowboys and miners passed through. The church sat at the other end, its white steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger of judgment. Between them sprawled the various establishments that kept the town alive, the general store, the bank, the barber shop, and the sheriff's office. It was as Margaret passed this last building that she noticed something had changed. A new horse stood tied to the rail outside, a magnificent black stallion that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Not the usual broken-down mounts that populated Willow Creek streets. This was a horse that spoke of authority, of someone who took pride in their position. She'd heard talk. Of course, the old sheriff, Walter Hayes, had finally retired after a bullet to the shoulder convinced him it was time to hang up his badge. The town council had brought in someone new, someone younger, though Margaret had paid little attention to the gossip. What concern was it of hers who wore the star as if summoned by her thoughts? The door to the sheriff's office opened, and a man stepped out onto the boardwalk. Margaret's steps faltered for just a moment as she took in the sight of him. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark vest and white shirt. His face was lean and sun-weathered with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray as winter storm clouds, holding a weight that seemed beyond his years. Sheriff Samuel Morrison paused on the boardwalk, adjusting his hat against the slanting sun. He'd been in Willow Creek for only a week, but already he could feel the pulse of the town, could sense its rhythms and undercurrents. Years of experience had taught him to read a place quickly, to identify potential troubles before they bloomed into violence. His gaze swept the street with practiced efficiency, noting the usual collection of cowboys lounging outside the saloon, the merchants going about their business, the women in their bonnets hurrying between errands, and she walked alone, which itself was unusual. Most of the respectable women in town traveled in pairs or groups, chattering like magpies. But this one moved with a quiet grace. Her head held high despite the obvious wear of her clothing. Something about her carriage spoke of both pride and weariness, a combination that drew his attention more than he cared to admit. Their eyes met for just an instant across the dusty street. And Sam felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of sorts, though he was certain they'd never met. She looked away quickly, color rising in her cheeks as she hurried on toward the general store. He found himself watching her go, noting the way she seemed to shrink into herself as she neared the busier part of town. "That's the Sullivan widow," a voice said at his elbow. Sam turned to find Jim Cooper, the bank manager, standing beside him with a knowing look. "Pretty little thing, ain't she? Been alone since her husband died. Some say she's too proud for her own good, keeping to herself out there." Sam felt a flash of irritation at the man's tone, but kept his expression neutral. "I make it a point not to listen to gossip." Mr. Cooper, the banker, chuckled. "Wise policy, Sheriff. Still, a man should know about all the citizens in his town, wouldn't you say? especially the vulnerable ones. There was something in the way he said it that made Sam's jaw tighten. But before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the saloon. Loud voices, the crash of breaking glass, and then a woman's cry of distress. Sam was moving before the sound had fully registered, his hand already checking the position of his Colt 45. He pushed through the gathering crowd to find 3 cowboys clearly deep in their cups surrounding someone near the entrance to the general store. As he drew closer, Sam realized with a start that it was the widow, Margaret Sullivan. He reminded himself. One of the men had hold of her basket, while another was making crude suggestions about how a lonely woman might earn some extra money. That's enough. Sam's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The authority in it made several onlookers step back. Let the lady pass. The largest of the 3 cowboys, a man with a scraggly beard and mean eyes, turned to face him. Well, the new lawman. Ain't you a sight? All shiny and clean. This here's a private conversation. Sheriff, no law against talking to a pretty woman. There is when the woman clearly doesn't welcome the attention, Sam replied evenly, his hand rested casually on his gun belt, the gesture seeming relaxed but ready. I'll say it once more. Let her pass. Margaret stood frozen between them. Her face pale, but her chin lifted in that gesture of defiance he'd noticed earlier. Her hands gripped her empty basket with white knuckles, and Sam could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest as she fought to maintain her composure. The bearded cowboy's face darkened. You don't know how things work around here yet, do you, Sheriff? Some folks in this town ain't as respectable as they pretend to be. Maybe you should ask around about the widow Sullivan before you go playing hero. The insinuation in his words was clear, and Sam saw Margaret flinch as if struck. Anger, cold and controlled, flowed through him. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the cowboy until they were nearly nose to nose. What I know, Sam said, his voice low and dangerous, is that you're drunk, disorderly, and harassing a citizen of this town. What I also know is that you're going to walk away right now, or you'll be spending the night in my jail. Your choice. For a long moment, the tension stretched taut between them. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see if the new sheriff would back up his words with action. Then, with a grunt of disgust, the bearded man stepped back. Come on, boys, he said to his companions. Ain't worth the trouble. But you remember, Sheriff, this town's got its ways. You'd best learn them quick. They slouched away toward the saloon, and the crowd began to disperse, though Sam could feel their curious gazes lingering. He turned to Margaret, who still stood rooted to the spot. Are you all right, ma'am? He asked, his voice gently. She looked up at him, and again he felt that strange pull, as if something in her recognized something in him. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Sheriff. Sam Morrison, he said, touching the brim of his hat. And you're Mrs. Sullivan? She nodded, seeming to gather herself. Margaret Sullivan, I should go. Thank you again. She turned to leave, but Sam found himself speaking before he could think better of it. Ma'am, if anyone bothers you again, you come find me. That's what I'm here for. She paused, glancing back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That's kind of you, Sheriff, but I've learned to take care of myself. As she walked away, Sam stood watching, aware that something had just begun, something that went against every rule he'd set for himself when he'd taken this job. He was here to enforce the law, to bring order to a lawless place. Getting involved with a widow, especially one who seemed to attract trouble and gossip, was the last thing he needed. Yet, as he made his way back to his office, Sam couldn't shake the image of those proud, wounded eyes, or the way she'd held herself with such dignity in the face of crude harassment. He'd seen many things in his years wearing a badge, but something about Margaret Sullivan had slipped past his defenses in a way that both troubled and intrigued him. The sun continued its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Another day in Willow Creek was drawing to a close. But for Sam Morrison and Margaret Sullivan, though neither could know it yet, something was just beginning. In a land where survival often meant choosing between heart and duty, between safety and desire, they had taken the first steps on a path that would test them both in ways they couldn't imagine. The wind picked up as darkness approached, sending tumbleweeds rolling down the empty street like restless spirits. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a wild, lonely sound that seemed to echo the unspoken longings that already stirred between a young widow and a sheriff who'd learned to armor his heart as surely as she had. The desert sunset blazed across the sky like spilled blood and gold, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost magical. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching as the familiar mountains turned purple in the dying light. The silver thread of Pike's Creek glimmered in the distance, and from somewhere beyond the ridge came the haunting call of wolves, a sound that never failed to remind her how wild this land remained, despite all attempts to tame it. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at the general store, and though she'd returned to town twice more for supplies, she'd been careful to go earlier in the day when the streets were quieter. She hadn't seen Sheriff Morrison again, though she'd caught glimpses of him from a distance, his tall figure unmistakable as he made his rounds, keeping the peace with a quiet authority that was already earning him respect among the townspeople. She shouldn't be thinking of him. Margaret knew this with the same certainty she knew the sun would rise tomorrow. Yet his face kept returning to her thoughts at the oddest moments while she milked the cows at dawn, while she kneaded bread dough. While she lay alone in her narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, those storm-gray eyes that had looked at her with such unexpected kindness. The way he'd stood up to those cowboys without hesitation, treating her with a respect she'd grown unaccustomed to. Margaret pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window, trying to ground herself in the present. She had no business entertaining such thoughts. She was a widow. He was the sheriff, and Willow Creek was a town that thrived on gossip. Any association between them would only fuel the whispers that already followed her like dust devils. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her from her reverie. Her body tensed instinctively. Visitors after dark rarely brought good news. But as the rider came into view in the last rays of sunlight, she recognized the black stallion and its rider. Sheriff Morrison drew up a respectful distance from her cabin, remaining mounted. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "I apologize for the late hour. I'm checking on folks out this way. We've had reports of rustlers working the area." Margaret stepped out onto her porch, acutely aware of her appearance, her hair coming loose from its pins after a long day's work, her apron stained with flour. "I haven't seen anything unusual, Sheriff." He nodded but made no move to leave in the gathering dusk. She could barely make out his features beneath the brim of his hat. "Your livestock secure for the night?" "Yes, the cows are in the barn," she hesitated, then found herself adding, "though I appreciate your concern." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with the evening songs of crickets and the distant yip of coyotes. Sam shifted in his saddle, and Margaret could sense his reluctance to leave as clearly as her own reluctance to go back inside. "It's a beautiful evening," he said finally, gesturing toward the sunset. "That's something I'm still getting used to out here. The way the sky seems to catch fire every night." "Where are you from originally?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Ohio originally, then various towns across Kansas and Colorado. Been wearing a badge for near 10 years now." He paused. "Never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home." I suppose there was something in his voice, a loneliness that echoed her own. Margaret found herself stepping closer to the porch rail. "It must be difficult always moving on." "Sometimes," he admitted, "though it's simpler in some ways, no ties to complicate things." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Margaret felt her cheeks warm and was grateful for the growing darkness. "Well, I should let you continue your rounds. I'm sure you have other homesteads to check." "I do," he agreed, but still didn't move. "Mrs. Sullivan, Margaret, if I may, I meant what I said before. If you have any trouble, any at all, you send word. There's no shame in asking for help. I've managed this long on my own, Sheriff Morrison." "Sam," he corrected gently. "And I don't doubt your capability, but even the strongest people need someone to watch their backs sometimes." Before she could respond, he touched the brim of his hat and wheeled his horse around, disappearing into the darkness. Margaret stood on the porch long after the sound of hoof-beats had faded, her heart beating with a rhythm she'd thought forgotten. Inside, she tried to focus on her evening tasks, mending a torn dress, preparing tomorrow's bread dough, but her hands trembled slightly, and twice she had to reduce stitches that went astray when she finally blew out her lamp and climbed into bed. She lay staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of their conversation. Meanwhile, Sam Morrison sat in his office, ostensibly reviewing wanted posters, but finding his thoughts continually drifting to a small cabin on the edge of town. He told himself the visit was purely professional. He was checking on all the outlying properties after all. But he knew that was only partly true. Something about Margaret Sullivan had lodged itself under his skin like a splinter, working deeper with each passing day. He thought about the way she'd looked in the fading light, beautiful despite her work-worn clothes, proud despite her circumstances. He'd seen how she held herself apart from the town, creating walls of dignity and distance. He understood those walls. He'd built similar ones around his own heart, brick by brick, over years of violence and loss. A lawman couldn't afford sentiment, couldn't allow feelings to cloud his judgment. Yet here he was, finding excuses to ride past her cabin to ensure her safety. Sam stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the main street. A few lights still glowed in the saloon, and he could hear the faint sound of a piano and raucous laughter. This was his world, keeping order among the chaos, standing between the lawless and the law-abiding. There was no place in it for soft feelings or romantic notions. But as he returned to his desk, Sam found himself thinking of Ohio, of the life he'd left behind when he'd first pinned on a badge. He'd been engaged once to a banker's daughter named Catherine. She'd been pretty and proper, everything a young man should want. But when he decided to become a lawman, she'd given him a choice. The badge or her. He'd chosen the badge, telling himself it was for the best, that he wasn't meant for domestic life. Now 10 years later, he wondered if he'd been wrong. Wondered what it would be like to have someone to come home to. Someone who'd worry when he rode out to face danger. Someone who'd be there to tend his wounds, both visible and hidden. Dangerous thoughts for a dangerous profession. Sam forced his attention back to the wanted posters, but Margaret's face seemed to hover at the edge of his vision. Those deep brown eyes holding secrets and sorrows he found himself wanting to understand. The next few days passed in a dance of near misses and stolen glances. Margaret found reasons to come to town when she knew Sam would be making his rounds. Sam found himself taking the long way back from patrol, a route that happened to pass by her cabin. They had exchanged polite nods, a few words about the weather or the news from back east. But beneath the propriety ran a current of awareness that grew stronger with each encounter. The townspeople began to notice. Of course, Willow Creek was too small for secrets, and the sight of their young sheriff showing particular attention to the Sullivan widow set tongues wagging. In the general store, the church ladies whispered behind their fans. In the saloon, the men made crude jokes and placed bets on how long before the sheriff would comfort the pretty widow. Margaret felt the weight of their speculation like a physical thing. She'd worked so hard to maintain her respectability, to prove she could survive on her own without becoming the kind of woman people whispered about. Now, through no fault of her own, or was it, she was becoming the subject of exactly the kind of gossip she'd tried to avoid. One evening, as purple shadows stretched across the desert and the first stars began to appear, she stood at her window again, watching the horizon. The sight of a lone rider approaching no longer surprised her. Sam had taken to checking on her property with increasing frequency, always with some official reason, always maintaining that careful distance that propriety demanded. But tonight something was different. Tonight he dismounted, tying his horse to the fence post. "Evening, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, removing his hat. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a cup of water. It's been a long day." She knew she should refuse. Knew that inviting him in, even for something as innocent as water, would only fuel the gossip. But the weariness in his voice, the slump of his shoulders, made her decision. "Of course, Sheriff, please come in." The cabin was small but clean, everything in its place. Sam ducked his head as he entered, suddenly seeming too large for the space. Margaret busied herself at the water pitcher, painfully aware of his presence, of the way he seemed to fill the room. "You have a nice home," he said, his eyes taking in the small touches that made the place more than just a shelter. The wild flowers in a jar on the table. The quilt folded over a chair. The books on a shelf by the window. "It's not much, but it's mine." She handed him the cup, careful not to let their fingers touch, "though sometimes I wonder how much longer I can hold on to it." He frowned. "Are you having troubles? Financial?" Margaret immediately regretted her words. "No, nothing like that. I manage well enough. It's not easy being alone out here. The town doesn't quite know what to do with a woman who won't remarry or move in with relatives back east." "Why don't you?" The question was gentle, genuinely curious. "Go back east. I mean, surely it would be easier." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the vast expanse of desert. "Because this is where I choose to be. Thomas and I came here together, full of dreams. He's gone. But this land, it gets into your blood. The freedom of it, even with all its dangers. Back east, I'd be smothered with propriety, married off to some suitable man who'd expect me to be grateful. Here, at least I'm free to make my own choices, even if they're hard ones." Sam set down the empty cup, his eyes never leaving her face. "I understand that the need to be free, even when freedom comes with a price." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, the careful distance they'd maintained seemed to collapse. The air between them crackled with possibility and danger. Margaret felt her heart racing, knew she should step back, should ask him to leave. Instead, she stood frozen, caught in the intensity of his gaze. "I should go," Sam said, his voice rough. "Thank you for the water." "Of course," she whispered, but neither moved. The lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls. And outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. They stood there, two people caught on the edge of something that could destroy them both, teetering between safety and the unknown. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the cloudless sky, casting the desert in shades of blue and silver. It had been 3 days since Sam's visit to her cabin. 3 days of Margaret trying to forget the way they'd stood there, caught between propriety and desire. She'd thrown herself into her work with renewed vigor, as if exhaustion could drive away the memory of his eyes, the roughness in his voice when he'd finally torn himself away. Tonight, sleep eluded her entirely. The cabin felt too small, too confining. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air. The desert was never truly quiet. Somewhere, an owl called, and the constant whisper of wind through sagebrush created a symphony all its own. She didn't hear the horse approaching until it was almost upon her. Her heart leaped, then settled into a rapid rhythm as she recognized the rider. Sam dismounted at the gate, and even in the moonlight, she could see the conflict written on his face. "I know I shouldn't be here," he said without preamble, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I've tried to stay away. God knows I've tried, but I can't stop thinking." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. Margaret stepped down from the porch, drawn by something stronger than wisdom or caution. The moonlight turned everything ethereal, dreamlike, as if they'd stepped outside the normal bounds of their daily lives. "Why did you come?" she asked softly, though she already knew the answer. It was the same reason she'd been unable to sleep. The same force that had kept her standing at windows watching for him. "Because I'm a fool," Sam said with a bitter laugh. "Because for 10 years I've lived by rules and duty. And for the first time I find myself wanting something more. Because when I look at you I see." He paused, searching for words. "I see possibility, and that terrifies me more than any outlaw ever has." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "We can't do this, Sam. You know we can't. The town already whispers. Your position, my reputation, what little I have left of it. We'd destroy each other. Would we?" He stepped closer, and she could smell leather and gunpowder, the honest sense of his profession. "Or would we save each other? Margaret, I've been dead inside for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to live for something beyond the next sunrise. Then I saw you that day, proud and alone, fighting battles I could only guess at, and something in me woke up." She was trembling now, though not from cold. "1 hour," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "That's all we can have, one forbidden hour, and then you ride away and we pretend this never happened." "Margaret," his voice was anguished. "Please." She looked up at him, letting him see all the longings she'd been hiding. "I've been alone for so long. Just 1 hour where I don't have to be the proper widow. Where you don't have to be the upstanding sheriff. 1 hour to remember what it feels like to be alive." Sam's control, held so tightly for weeks, finally shattered. He pulled her into his arms and Margaret melted against him, feeling the solid warmth of his chest, the strength in the arms that encircled her. For a moment, they simply held each other, two lonely souls finding harbor in the storm of their lives. Then he tilted her chin up, and their lips met in a kiss that was desperate and tender at once. Margaret felt as if she were falling and flying simultaneously, every nerve in her body singing with a joy she'd thought lost forever. His hands tangled in her hair, and she pressed closer, trying to memorize every sensation, every heartbeat. They pulled apart, breathing hard, and Sam rested his forehead against hers. "God help me, Margaret. I think I'm falling in love with you." "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say such things. We have this hour. Let that be enough." He led her to a flat rock near the cabin where they could sit together, the desert spreading out before them like an ocean of silver. Margaret leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her as if she were precious and fragile. "Tell me about your dreams," she said softly. "The ones you had before the badge." Sam was quiet for a long moment. "I wanted to be a teacher once. Can you imagine? Sam Morrison, shaping young minds instead of hunting outlaws. My mother had it all planned out. I'd marry Catherine, settle down, have children who'd call me Papa and climb on my knee to hear stories. What happened? The war happened. I was barely 16 when I enlisted, full of notions about glory and honor. By the time it ended, I'd seen too much death to go back to that peaceful life. The badge seemed like a way to make sense of it all, to stand between the darkness and the innocent. But somewhere along the way I forgot there was supposed to be more to life than just standing guard." Margaret lifted her head to look at him. "You're a good man, Sam Morrison. The town is lucky to have you. And what about your dreams?" he asked, tracing her cheek with one gentle finger. Before you came west. Oh, they were simple ones. A home filled with laughter. Children playing in the yard. Growing old with someone I loved. Thomas and we tried so hard. But the babies, they never came. And then he was gone. And I thought all dreams died with him. But lately, she stopped, afraid to continue. Lately, Sam prompted lately. I found myself dreaming again. Foolish dreams about impossible things. They sat in silence, watching clouds drift across the moon. Time seemed to slow, each moment crystallizing into something precious. Margaret knew she should send him away. Knew that every minute increased the risk of discovery, but she couldn't bring herself to break the spell. Sometimes, Sam said quietly, I imagine a different life. One where I could court you properly, bring you flowers, take you to church socials without the whole town counting it as scandal. I'd sit in your parlor and read poetry badly while you tried not to laugh. I'd ask your father for your hand. If he were alive, and promised to cherish you all my days. That's a beautiful dream, Margaret whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. I'd build you a bigger house, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. With a proper kitchen and windows facing east so you could watch the sunrise. We'd plant a garden, raise horses maybe, and in the evenings we'd sit on the porch and watch our children play while the sun set behind the mountains. Stop, Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. Please stop. I'd love you in daylight, Sam said fiercely, not hidden in darkness like something shameful. I'd show the whole world how proud I was to have you beside me. You deserve that, Margaret. You deserve so much more than stolen hours and whispered secrets. She turned in his arms, pressing her fingers to his lips. But this is what we have. This one forbidden hour under the moon, and I'll treasure it all my days, even as I pretend it never happened. They kissed again desperately, knowing time was slipping away like sand through their fingers. Margaret tried to memorize everything. The roughness of his jaw, the way his hands cradled her face, the sound of his breathing in the quiet night. She knew that tomorrow she would have to armor her heart again, would have to pass him on the street with nothing more than a polite nod. But tonight, for this brief, forbidden hour, she was simply a woman in the arms of the man she was falling in love with. The moon had traveled considerably across the sky when Sam finally pulled back. I should go, he said, though every line of his body spoke of reluctance. Yes, Margaret agreed, though she made no move to leave his embrace. They stood slowly as if movement might shatter something precious. Sam cooped her face in his hands, studying her in the moonlight as if trying to burn her image into his memory. This can't happen again, he said. You know that. I know. I'll stay away. Keep my distance. Let the gossip die down. That's wise. But neither moved. The wind picked up, sending Margaret's hair streaming like a banner. I love you, Sam said suddenly, the words torn from him. I know I shouldn't say it, no, it only makes things harder, but I need you to know. Whatever happens, wherever life takes us, know that Samuel Morrison loved Margaret Sullivan truly and completely, if only for one forbidden hour, beneath a desert moon. Margaret's composure finally broke. She threw her arms around his neck, kissing him with all the passion and pain in her heart. And I love you, she whispered against his lips. God help me. I love you too. They clung to each other for one last moment. Then Sam stepped back. He walked to his horse without looking back, knowing that if he turned, he'd never find the strength to leave. Margaret stood watching as he mounted and rode away, his figure growing smaller until it was swallowed by the darkness. She stayed there long after he'd gone, arms wrapped around herself, feeling as if part of her soul had ridden away with him. The moon continued its journey across the sky, indifferent to human heartbreak. Eventually, the cold drove her inside, where she lay on her narrow bed, pressing her fingers to lips that could still feel his kiss. In town, Sam sat at his desk, staring at nothing. He'd removed his badge and placed it before him, its metal surface gleaming in the lamplight. For the first time in 10 years, it felt heavy, a weight he wasn't sure he could continue to bear. He thought of Margaret alone in her cabin, thought of the life they could never have, and wondered if duty and honor were worth the price of happiness. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, marking the end of their forbidden hour. But both knew that some things once begun could not be so easily ended. The moon set, the sun would rise, and they would face another day of pretending. But in their hearts, that hour would live on, a perfect, painful reminder of what could never be. The whisper started as a trickle and swelled to a flood. Within days of that moonlit night, it seemed all of Willow Creek had something to say about Sheriff Morrison and the Sullivan widow. Someone had seen his horse near her cabin at an unseemly hour. Someone else swore they'd noticed the way he looked at her during Sunday service. The flames of gossip needed little fuel in a town starved for scandal. Margaret felt the change immediately. At the general store, conversation ceased when she entered. Women who had previously offered polite nods now turned their backs, clustering together like hens protecting their virtue from contamination. Even Mr. Garrett, the shopkeeper, who had always been cordial, served her with eyes averted and lips pressed thin with disapproval. "That'll be $2, Mrs. Sullivan," he said curtly, pushing her purchases across the counter, as if afraid to let their hands accidentally touch. Margaret counted out the coins with steady fingers, though inside she trembled with humiliation and anger. She'd done nothing wrong, nothing beyond one stolen hour of happiness in a life filled with loneliness. But in Willow Creek, the appearance of impropriety was as damning as the deed itself. As she gathered her basket, Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, no relation to the sheriff despite the shared surname, swept past with her daughters in tow. "Come along, girls," she said loudly. "We must be careful about the company we keep. A woman's reputation is her most precious possession." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stood frozen as mother and daughters exited, their skirts rustling with self-righteousness. Behind her, she heard someone mutter, "Always knew she was too proud for her own good, husband barely cold in the ground." Margaret fled the store, her cheeks burning. The walk back to her cabin had never seemed longer. Each person she passed seemed to look at her with knowing eyes as if her secret were written across her face. By the time she reached her gate, tears were streaming down her cheeks. She'd lost 3 customers that week. Families who suddenly decided they could get their milk and bread elsewhere. Her already precarious financial situation grew more unstable with each passing day. But worse than the loss of income was the crushing weight of isolation. She'd always been alone, but now she was truly shunned. Sam, meanwhile, faced his own trials. The respect he'd earned through weeks of fair dealing began to erode as the gossip reached the saloons and gambling halls. Men who had previously deferred to his authority now tested him with sly comments and knowing looks. Keeping the peace must be exhausting work. Sheriff Jake Colton drawled one evening as Sam made his rounds. "All that riding out to check on lonely widows. Man's got to be thorough, I suppose." Sam's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. Rising to the bait would only confirm their suspicions. He'd maintained his distance from Margaret as promised, hadn't even ridden past her cabin, but the damage was already done. In a town like Willow Creek, smoke was as good as fire. The situation came to a head when Mayor Frederick Walsh and 2 members of the town council appeared in Sam's office on a Thursday afternoon. Walsh, a portly man with graying whiskers and an inflated sense of his own importance, settled into the chair across from Sam's desk with obvious reluctance. "Sheriff Morrison," he began, pulling at his collar, "we need to discuss a delicate matter." Sam leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression in neutral, though he knew what was coming. "I'm listening." "There have been concerns raised about your conduct, specifically regarding your attention to the Sullivan widow." Walsh's face reamed. "Now, we're not saying anything improper has occurred, mind you, but the appearance of favoritism, the late-night visits. I've checked on many homesteads outside town." Sam interrupted calmly. "It's part of my duty to ensure the safety of all citizens, especially those living alone." "Be that as it may," Councilman Roberts interjected. "The talk is becoming disruptive. We've had complaints from several upstanding families. They question whether a sheriff who can't maintain proper boundaries can be trusted to uphold the law impartially." Sam felt anger rise in his chest, but kept his voice level. "Has anyone questioned my handling of any case? Have I shown favoritism in any legal matter?" "Not yet," Walsh admitted. "But we must think of the town's reputation. Willow Creek is trying to attract respectable families, businesses. We can't have scandal attached to our law enforcement. What exactly are you asking of me, Mayor?" Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps it would be best if you limited your interactions with Mrs. Sullivan. No more personal visits. Let her find someone else to turn to for assistance if needed. Distance yourself from the situation until the talk dies down. And if I refuse," the 3 men exchanged glances. "Then we'd have to reconsider whether you're the right fit for Willow Creek," Robert said bluntly. "Your contract comes up for renewal in 2 months. It would be a shame if the council decided not to extend it." After they left, Sam sat alone in his office, staring at the badge on his desk. He'd worn it with pride for a decade, had defined himself by it. Now it felt like a chain, binding him to expectations that crushed any hope of personal happiness. He thought of Margaret facing the town's cruelty alone, and his hands clenched into fists. That evening, a commotion erupted on Main Street. The Briggs brothers, Carl, Wade, and younger Jess, had ridden in already half drunk and looking for trouble. They'd started at the Silver Dollar, harassing the working girls and picking fights with anyone who looked at them sideways. By the time Sam arrived, they'd moved on to entertainment of a different sort. Margaret had been forced to come to town for supplies she couldn't postpone purchasing. As she tried to hurry past the saloon, the brothers had surrounded her, Carl grabbing her basket while Wade blocked her path. Well, Carl slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey. The merry widow herself heard you've been keeping the sheriff warm at night. How about sharing some of that warmth with us? Please let me pass, Margaret said, her voice steady despite her fear. Don't be unfriendly now, Wade leered, reaching for her arm. We're just being neighborly. Isn't that right, boys? Just wanting to be as neighborly as the good sheriff. A crowd had gathered, but no one moved to help. Some watched with disapproval. Whether for the brothers' behavior or for Margaret herself was unclear. Others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. That's enough. Sam's voice cracked like a whip. He strode through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun. Back away from the lady now. Carl turned, weaving slightly. Lady, that what we're calling her now. Whole town knows what she is. Sheriff, just like they know what you've been doing. I said back away. Sam's voice had gone deadly quiet. Or what? Wade challenged. You'll arrest us for talking? Face it, Morrison. Your authority's shot. Nobody respects a lawman who can't keep his hands off the local widow. Jess, the youngest and drunkest, made the mistake of reaching for Margaret again. Sam moved faster than thought, his fist connecting with the boy's jaw and sending him sprawling in the dust. In an instant, all three brothers went for their guns. Sam had his Colt out and aimed before they could clear leather. Don't, he warned. I'd hate to explain to your mother why I had to shoot all three of her boys in one night. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then Carl slowly raised his hands. This ain't over, Morrison. You've shown your true colors now. The whole town's seen it. You choosing her over the law. The law says I protect all citizens from harassment and assault. Sam replied, that's exactly what I'm doing. Now you boys have two choices. Sleep it off in my jail or ride out now and keep riding until you sober up. The brothers chose to ride out, but their parting looks promised trouble. As the crowd dispersed, Sam turned to Margaret. In her hands, Are you hurt? He asked quietly. No, she gathered her scattered purchases, avoiding his eyes. Thank you, Sheriff. I'm sorry for the trouble, Margaret. Please, she whispered. Not here. Not with everyone watching. She hurried away, leaving Sam standing alone in the street around him. He could feel the town's judgment like a physical weight. He'd crossed the line by showing emotion, by letting them see that Margaret meant something to him beyond just another citizen. The consequences would come swiftly. That night, Margaret sat in her cabin with the door barred and her father's old rifle across her lap. The brothers' words echoed in her mind, ugly and threatening. She knew their type. They wouldn't forget the humiliation of backing down. And now that the town had essentially given permission to treat her as fair game, who knew what might happen? She thought of Sam facing down 3 armed men for her sake, and her heart ached with love and guilt in equal measure. He was risking everything, his job, his reputation, possibly his life. Because of her, the noble thing would be to leave town, to remove herself from his path before she destroyed him completely. But as she sat there in the lamplight, Margaret realized she couldn't run. This was her home, bought with her husband's dreams and her own stubborn determination. She'd done nothing wrong except allow herself one moment of happiness. 1 hour of being held by a good man who saw her as more than a widow or a scandal. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively. Margaret checked the rifle's load and settled in to wait. Whatever came next, she would face it. She'd survived loss and loneliness and the crushing weight of propriety. She could survive this too. But as the first drops of rain began to fall, she couldn't help but whisper a prayer for Sam Morrison, the man who'd given her one forbidden hour of joy and now stood to lose everything because of it. The sandstorm hit Willow Creek like the wrath of God himself. It rolled in from the desert in a wall of brown fury, turning day to night and filling the air with stinging grit that found its way through every crack and crevice. But the storm that raged outside was nothing compared to the violence that erupted in its wake. The Wallace gang, 6 men led by Tom Wallace, a former Confederate raider turned outlaw, had been watching Willow Creek for weeks. They knew the sheriff was distracted, his authority weakened by scandal. They knew the town was divided, its unity fractured by gossip and judgment. The sandstorm provided perfect cover for what they'd planned. They hit the bank first just as the worst of the storm struck. The few people on the streets were bent double against the wind, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. The sound of shattering glass and gunfire was swallowed by the howling gale. By the time Sam reached the scene, the gang had vanished into the brown murk, leaving 2 men dead and the bank safe emptied. Which way did they go? Sam shouted to Homer Gibbs, the bank guard who lay bleeding from a shoulder wound. Can't say for certain. Homer gasped. But Wallace, he was laughing, said something about settling all debts today. A chill ran down Sam's spine that had nothing to do with the storm. All debts. He thought of the Briggs brothers' threats of the connections between various criminal elements that he'd been tracking. And suddenly, with terrible clarity, he understood. Get me every man who can shoot, he ordered Deputy Chen, who just arrived. They're not done. This is just the beginning. As Sam gathered what men he could find, pitifully few. As many refused to follow a compromised sheriff, the gang's true purpose became clear. Tom Wallace had a brother who died in Willow Creek's jail 5 years ago, before Sam's time. But Wallace blamed the town, and he'd found willing allies in those who held grudges against the current sheriff. The storm provided perfect cover as they moved through town like vengeful ghosts. The general store burned, flames barely visible through the sand, but smoke adding to the choking atmosphere. The mayor's house was ransacked. Walsh himself barely escaping with his life. It was terrorism, pure and simple, designed to break the town's spirit. But the outlaws had made one crucial error. They'd split up. And Carl Briggs, the drunkard from days before, had convinced Wallace that there was one more score to settle. A certain widow living alone outside town, unprotected and vulnerable. Margaret heard them coming before she saw them. The storm muffled sound, but she'd learned to read the desert's moods, to sense danger in the way the wind shifted. She'd barricaded the door and taken position by the window with her rifle, but she knew she couldn't hold off multiple men for long. Through the swirling sand, she saw 4 riders approaching. Her hands were steady as she sighted down the barrel, picking out Carl Briggs in the lead. Behind him rode 3 men she didn't recognize. Hard cases with guns drawn and violence in their bearing. Come on out, widow woman, Carl's voice carried despite the wind. We got business to discuss about you and that sheriff of yours. Margaret's answer was a rifle shot that took his hat off. Carl cursed and dove from his horse as the others scattered, taking cover behind whatever they could find. That's no way to treat visitors, one of the outlaws called. We just want to talk, maybe teach you a lesson about keeping your place. Another shot from Margaret splintered wood near the speaker's head. She had maybe a dozen rounds left, not nearly enough if they decided to rush the cabin, but she'd make them pay for every step. The siege began in earnest. The outlaws fired at the windows, trying to keep her pinned down while they maneuvered closer. Margaret moved from window to window, making her shots count, but she could feel the noose tightening. One man had reached the barn. Another was working his way around back. Soon they'd have her surrounded. That's when she heard it. The thunder of hoof-beats that had nothing to do with the storm. Through the sand emerged Sam Morrison riding hard with 5 men behind him. His badge caught what little light penetrated the storm. A beacon in the chaos. The outlaws caught in the open scrambled for better positions. Gunfire erupted from all directions. The sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of shotguns. Margaret saw Sam leap from his horse, using it as cover as he advanced on the cabin. Margaret, he shouted. Stay down, she wanted to call back to warn him about the man in the barn, but bullets were shattering what remained of her windows. All she could do was keep shooting, trying to cover Sam's approach. The battle was fierce but brief. Sam fought like a man possessed, his usual calm replaced by cold fury. He'd seen what these men had done in town, knew what they'd intended for Margaret, and mercy was the furthest thing from his mind. One by one the outlaws fell or fled into the storm. Carl Briggs made a last desperate attempt, breaking from cover to rush the cabin's front door. Sam's bullet caught him mid-stride, spinning him around. Carl fell face first in the dust, his grand plans for revenge ending in the dirt outside a widow's cabin. As the gunfire died away, Sam approached the cabin cautiously. Margaret, it's over. Are you hurt? The door opened slowly and Margaret emerged, rifle still in hand. Her hair was wild, her dress torn, but she stood straight and proud. I'm all right, she said. Then her composure cracked. Sam, I was so frightened. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms regardless of who might see. She clung to him, shaking now that the danger had passed. And he held her as if he'd never let go. I thought I'd lost you, he murmured into her hair. When I realized where they were headed, God, Margaret, I've never been so scared in my life. Around them, the storm was beginning to abate. The other men who'd ridden with Sam, including Deputy Chen and surprisingly Homer Gibbs, with his arm in a sling, stood at a respectful distance. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful as they witnessed the embrace. "Sheriff," Chin called softly. "We should check the barn, make sure we got them all." Sam reluctantly released Margaret and returned to his duties. They found one dead outlaw in the barn and signs that 2 others had fled into the desert. Tom Wallace himself was discovered later, having succumbed to a bullet wound while trying to escape with the stolen bank money. As the storm finally passed, leaving the world scoured clean and strange in the sudden stillness, the people of Willow Creek began to emerge from their homes. Many made their way to Margaret's cabin. Drawn by reports of the battle, they found their sheriff organizing the aftermath with his usual efficiency. But something had changed. Mayor Walsh, his own home damaged and his family terrorized, watched Sam work. He saw how the sheriff had risked everything to protect the town, how he'd fought hardest to save someone the town had been ready to cast out. The mayor's wife stood beside him, clutching their children, alive because Sam Morrison had done his duty despite the town's treatment of him. "I believe I owe you an apology, Sheriff," Walsh said quietly. "And you as well, Mrs. Sullivan. I let gossip and narrow-mindedness cloud my judgment. You've both shown more courage and integrity than the rest of us combined." It wasn't a complete vindication. There would always be those who whispered and judged. But as neighbor helped neighbor in the storm's aftermath, as the story spread of how Margaret had held off 4 outlaws alone, and how Sam had rode through hell to save her, the tide of opinion began to turn. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, the self-righteous woman from the general store, approached Margaret hesitantly. "I wanted to say that," as she swallowed hard. "My husband was one of the men killed at the bank. If Sheriff Morrison hadn't stopped those outlaws, they might have come for the families next. I was wrong about you both, and I'm sorry." Margaret accepted the apology with quiet grace, though she knew it came as much from fear as genuine remorse. Still, it was a beginning. As the sun set on that violent day, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Sam found Margaret sitting on her damaged porch wrapped in a blanket. The cabin bore the scars of battle-broken windows, bullet-pocked walls, but it still stood. "It'll need repairs," he said, settling beside her. "Yes." She leaned against his shoulder, too tired to worry about propriety. "But it's still home." They sat in silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be reports to file, repairs to make, relationships to rebuild. Sam's position was more secure now, but the underlying tensions remained. Their feelings for each other hadn't changed, nor had the complicated reality of their situation. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of storm and violence, they simply sat together. They'd faced death and emerged alive. They'd protected what mattered despite the cost, and in a land where survival itself was a daily victory. That was no small thing. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, "for coming, for fighting for me even when the town had turned against us both." Sam took her hand, no longer caring who might see. "I would risk everything for you," he said, echoing words spoken on a moonlit night that seemed a lifetime ago. "I meant it then and I mean it now. Whatever comes next, we'll face it." The storms passed. "Margaret, maybe it's time to stop hiding." The cave was little more than a hollow in the rock face, but it provided shelter from the bitter wind that howled through the canyon. Sam had found Margaret there after tracking her for 3 hours through terrain that would have defeated most men. She'd fled when new threats emerged. Wallace's remaining gang members, seeking vengeance for their leader's death. She huddled against the back wall, her rifle across her knees, looking like a wild creature driven to bay. When she saw him, her face crumpled with relief and exhaustion. "How did you find me?" she whispered, her voice. "I'll always find you," Sam said, ducking into the cave and immediately checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "No, just cold and tired. So tired of running. So." He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then built a small fire near the cave mouth, positioning himself between her and any danger that might approach. Outside, night was falling, bringing with it a cold that cut to the bone. They came to the cabin just after dawn, Margaret explained, staring into the flames. 4 of them. I barely got out the back window. I could hear them destroying everything. All my memories of Thomas, our life together. "I'm sorry," Sam said quietly. "I should have posted guards. Should have known they'd come back. It's not your fault." She moved closer to him, seeking warmth and comfort. "How long can we keep living like this? You protecting me? Me bringing danger to your door?" Sam pulled her against his side, feeling her shiver despite the fire. "As long as it takes. I've sent word to the U.S. Marshals. They're sending men to help round up the rest of the gang. This will end, Margaret." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind and the distant yip of coyotes. The cave was crude shelter, but with Sam beside her, Margaret felt safer than she had in days. She allowed herself to lean into his strength, to stop being strong just for a moment. "I've been thinking," she said eventually, "about that night, our forbidden hour. Do you regret it?" "Never." His response was immediate and fierce. "That hour showed me what I'd been missing, what we could have if the world were different." "But the world isn't different," Margaret said sadly. "You're still the sheriff. I'm still a widow who's brought nothing but trouble. The town may have softened toward us after the attack, but that doesn't mean they'd accept us together." Sam was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You know what I realized during that gunfight at your cabin? When I thought I might lose you, I realized that I've been living my life by other people's rules, the town's expectations, society's demands, even my own rigid ideas about duty and propriety." He shifted to face her, his gray eyes intense in the firelight. "I've worn this badge for 10 years, Margaret. I've upheld the law, kept the peace, done everything expected of a good lawman. But what has it brought me? Respect that vanishes the moment I show any humanity. A life so empty that 1 hour with you felt like coming alive for the first time." "Sam, no. Let me finish." He took her hands in his, noting how small and cold they were. "When I saw those outlaws heading for your cabin, nothing else mattered. Not the badge, not the town's opinion, not my reputation, only you. And if I had to choose again, I'd make the same choice every time." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time I stopped living for everyone else's approval. Maybe it's time I chose happiness over duty, love over lonely honor." "You'd give up being sheriff. It's who you are." "No," Sam corrected gently. "It's what I do. Who I am is the man who loves you. The man who wants to build a life with you if you'll have me. Not in secret, not in shadow, but in the full light of day." Margaret pulled back, searching his face. The town will accept it or not, their choice. But I'm done letting their judgment dictate our lives." "Margaret Sullivan, I'm asking you not for one forbidden hour, but for all the hours we have left. Marry me. Let me protect you as your husband, not just as the sheriff. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." The proposal hung in the air between them like a challenge to fate itself. Margaret's breath caught, her heart racing with possibilities and fears. "Sam, we barely know each other beyond these stolen moments and violent circumstances. Then let's change that," he said earnestly. "Let me court you properly, bring you flowers, sit in your parlor once we rebuild it, and read that terrible poetry I mentioned. Take you to church on Sundays with my ring on your finger, proud for everyone to see. We'll face their whispers together until the whispers turn to acceptance. And if they don't accept it, if the town council refuses to renew your contract, then we'll go somewhere else. There are other towns, other places that need lawmen. Or maybe I'll try something different altogether. Ranch work or hunting guides for Eastern tourists. I'm good with my hands. Margaret, I can provide for us wherever we go." Margaret was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the future he was painting. "You do that? Leave everything you've built here?" "I would risk everything for you," Sam said, echoing the words that had become their refrain. "Haven't I proved that already?" A sound from outside made them both freeze. The clatter of rocks, the snort of a horse. Sam immediately moved to shield Margaret, his hand on his gun. But then a familiar voice called out, "Sheriff Morrison, it's Deputy Chin. The marshal's men have arrived. We've tracked you this far. Are you in there?" Relief flooded through Sam. "We're here. Chin, Mrs. Sullivan is safe." Within minutes, the cave was surrounded by lawmen. The hunt for the remaining outlaws would continue. But for now, Margaret was safe as they prepared to return to town. U.S. Marshal John Hartley pulled Sam aside. "Hell of a thing you've done here, Morrison. Tracking these boys, protecting the citizens. There's a job opening in the Marshal Service if you're interested. More authority, better pay. You could even pick your posting. Denver, Santa Fe, wherever you and your wife want to settle." Sam glanced at Margaret, who was being helped onto a horse by Deputy Chin. "My wife." Hartley grinned. "Son, I've been doing this for 20 years. I know the look of a man who's made his choice. The offer stands. Whenever you're ready." The ride back to town was surreal. The sun was rising, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold. Margaret rode beside Sam, still wearing his coat, exhausted but oddly at peace. She'd made her decision somewhere in that cave, somewhere between his proposal and the arrival of help. As they crested the final ridge and saw Willow Creek spread below them, she reached over and touched Sam's hand. "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her, hope dawning in his eyes. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll face whatever comes with you. Yes, I'll take the risk because a lifetime with you is worth any price. Sam's smile transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. He lifted her hand to his lips, not caring that the entire rescue party could see. There's something else, Margaret said. A small smile playing at her lips despite her exhaustion. That night in the cave when you were talking about rebuilding my parlor. You should know I'm a terrible hostess. I burned biscuits and my coffee could strip paint. Good thing I'm not marrying you for your cooking, Sam replied, his eyes twinkling. And I snore, she added. Thomas used to say I sounded like a freight train. I'll buy earplugs. And I have opinions, strong ones, about politics and religion and whether the railroad should come through town. I wouldn't expect anything less from the woman who held off 4 outlaws with a hunting rifle. They rode into Willow Creek as the town was waking up. People emerged from their homes and businesses to watch the procession pass. Some still looked disapproving, but many more nodded respectfully or even smiled. They'd seen courage under fire from both their sheriff and the widow Sullivan. Perhaps it was time to let old prejudices die at Margaret's damaged cabin. Sam helped her dismount. Rest, he ordered gently. I'll handle the reports and arrange for repairs to start. And Margaret, this evening I'm coming to call on you properly. Front door, flowers in hand, the whole production. It's time we stopped hiding. She smiled up at him, not caring that half the town was watching. I'll try not to burn the biscuits. As Sam rode away to his duties, Margaret stood before her bullet-scarred home. It would need extensive repairs, but it would stand like her. It had weathered the storm. And now, perhaps it was time to build something new within these walls, a life not of loneliness and mere survival, but of love and shared dreams. The forbidden hour in the moonlight had led to this moment in the morning sun. What had begun in secrecy would continue in openness. There would still be challenges. There always were in a land as unforgiving as this. But Margaret Sullivan and Sam Morrison would face them together. No longer sheriff and widow, but partners in the grand adventure of life in the American West. The dawn broke blood-red over Willow Creek, painting the desert in shades of crimson and gold. It was the kind of sunrise that promised violence, and Sam Morrison had learned to read such omens during his years wearing the badge. He stood on the ridge overlooking the town, Marshall Hartley beside him, watching dust clouds in the distance. That could only mean one thing. The remaining Wallace gang members were making their final play. 12 riders, maybe 15, Hartley observed, lowering his field glasses. They've gathered reinforcements. This won't be like the skirmishes we've had. This will be war. Sam nodded grimly. They'd spent 3 days preparing for this moment, fortifying the town, drilling the volunteers who'd stepped forward to defend their homes. Margaret had insisted on helping, organizing the women to prepare medical supplies and ammunition. She moved through town with quiet efficiency, her presence now a source of strength rather than scandal. Your ladies got sand, Hartley commented, following Sam's gaze to where Margaret was directing the placement of water barrels for the wounded. Not many women would stay after what she's been through. She's not running anymore, Sam said with quiet pride. Neither am I. The marshal clapped him on the shoulder. That job offer still stands. Morrison, after this is over, you and Mrs. Sullivan could start fresh somewhere else. We'll see, Sam replied, though his eyes never left Margaret. First we survive this. The outlaws hit at noon. When the sun was directly overhead and shadows offered no refuge, they came in 3 waves, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. The air filled with gun smoke in the sharp crack of rifles as Willow Creek fought for its life. Sam commanded from the sheriff's office, using its reinforced walls and strategic position to anchor the defense. Deputy Chin held the bank with 5 volunteers, while Marshal Hartley's men covered the main street from rooftops and windows. It was textbook defensive positioning. But the outlaws had desperation on their side. Margaret worked in the church, which had been converted to a makeshift hospital. She moved among the wounded with steady hands and calm words. Though her heart raced every time she heard Sam's voice shouting orders outside, Dr. Holcomb, the town's elderly physician, worked beside her, marveling at her composure. You've done this before, he observed as she efficiently bandaged a man's shoulder. My husband was sick for a long time before he died. Margaret replied, already moving to the next patient. I learned to do what was necessary. The battle raged for 2 hours. The outlaws, finding the main street too well defended, tried to flank through the Mexican quarter, but they hadn't counted on the residents there joining the fight. Led by Manuel Vasquez, whose daughter Sam had once saved from a runaway horse. The Mexican families fought with fierce determination to protect their adopted town. The tide turned when Jake Colton, the same man who'd made snide comments about Sam weeks earlier, took a bullet meant for Deputy Chen as he lay bleeding in the dust. Sam broke cover to drag him to safety, exposing himself to enemy fire. Margaret, watching from the church window, felt her heart stop as bullets winded around the man she loved. But the townspeople had seen enough. Inspired by their sheriff's courage, men who'd been holding back joined the fight. Even Mayor Walsh, portly and inexperienced, grabbed a shotgun and took position at a window. The increased firepower began to tell on the outlaws. The gang's final desperate assault came late in the afternoon. The remaining 8 outlaws, led by Wallace's Lieutenant Ben Steele, charged the sheriff's office in a last attempt to kill Sam and break the town's spirit. They might have succeeded. But Margaret saw them gathering for the charge. Without thinking, she grabbed a rifle from the church's defensive stack and ran into the street. "Sam, Westside, they're coming." Her warning gave the defenders precious seconds to prepare. As Steele and his men rounded the corner, they met a wall of lead. The charge faltered, broke, and suddenly it was over. 3 outlaws lay dead in the street. 2 more were captured and the rest fled into the desert where Hartley's men waited. As the gun's smoke cleared and the ringing silence of aftermath descended, Willow Creek took stock. They'd lost 2 men with 6 more wounded. But the town had held. More importantly, they'd stood together. Anglo and Mexican, merchant and laborer, all united in defending their home. Sam found Margaret in the street, still holding the rifle, her dress stained with blood from the wounded she tended. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, kissing her fiercely while the whole town watched. This time, instead of scandalized whispers, a cheer went up from the defenders. "Guess that settles the question of propriety," Deputy Chin said with a grin, nursing a graze on his arm. Mayor Walsh approached, his dignity somewhat impaired by the gunpowder stains on his vest. "Sheriff Morrison, Mrs. Sullivan, I believe I speak for the town council when I say we owe you both an apology and a debt of gratitude. You've shown us what real courage looks like and what really matters when the chips are down." The cleanup took days. Windows were repaired, walls patched, the dead buried with appropriate ceremony. But something fundamental had changed in Willow Creek. The shared danger had burned away petty prejudices and social divisions. Margaret was no longer the scandalous widow, but the woman who risked her life to save the town. Sam was no longer the compromised sheriff, but the leader who inspired them to victory. A week after the battle, as evening painted the sky in gentle pastels, Sam Morrison stood before Judge Theodore Banks in Margaret's rebuilt parlor. The small room was packed with witnesses. Deputy Chin stood as best man, while Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, who'd completely reversed her opinion, served as matron of honor. Half the town crowded outside, peering through windows. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved through all her travels. It was simple white cotton with small blue flowers embroidered on the collar. Nothing fancy, but Sam thought she'd never looked more beautiful. Her eyes shone as Judge Banks began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we gather here in the sight of God in this company to join Samuel Morrison and Margaret Sullivan in holy matrimony." The words washed over Sam as he stood holding Margaret's hands. Scarcely believing this moment had come just months ago. He'd been a lonely lawman going through the motions of duty. Now he stood ready to pledge his life to a woman whose courage matched his own. "Samuel," Judge Banks prompted, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Sam said firmly, his voice carrying to the crowd outside. "I would risk everything for her, and I do so gladly." It wasn't the traditional response, but no one corrected him. They'd all seen the truth of those words proven in blood and fire. "Margaret, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Margaret's voice was clear and strong. "I do with all my heart." When Judge Banks pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer from the assembled crowd could be heard clear across town. Sam kissed his bride while rice rained down and Manuel Vasquez's mariachi band struck up a celebratory tune. The reception spilled out into the street, becoming an impromptu town celebration. Tables appeared laden with food. Lanterns were strung between buildings, and soon half of Willow Creek was dancing under the stars. It was a far cry from the social isolation Margaret had endured just weeks before. "No regrets?" Sam asked as they took a break from dancing, standing together on the same porch where they'd first truly talked. "Only one," Margaret said, smiling up at him. "I regret that we wasted so much time worrying about what others thought. That forbidden hour in the moonlight. It shouldn't have been forbidden at all." "Perhaps not," Sam agreed, pulling her close. But it led us here to this moment and I wouldn't change a thing. Marshall Hartley approached, dust covered from the trail. Congratulations to you both, Morrison. That job offer, I need an answer. The position in Santa Fe is yours if you want it. Good pay, house provided, and a town that could use a man of your caliber. Sam looked at Margaret, a silent question in his eyes. She thought of the cabin where she grieved and struggled and finally found love again. Then she looked at her new husband and smiled. Whither thou goest, she said softly. Sam turned back to Hartley. Well, take it, but give us a month to settle things here. Help them find a new sheriff. Fair enough. Hartley shook their hands. The U.S. Marshals are lucky to get you, both of you. I have a feeling Mrs. Morrison will be as much an asset as her husband. As the evening wore on, and the celebration continued, Sam and Margaret slipped away to the ridge overlooking town, the same ridge where he'd stood that morning preparing for battle. Now it was peaceful, the town lights twinkling below like fallen stars. From forbidden love to a future in Santa Fe. Margaret mused. It's been quite a journey. It's not over. Sam reminded her. This is just the beginning. New town, new challenges, new dreams to build together. Margaret leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. As long as we're together, I'm ready for anything. They stood there as the moon rose, the same moon that had witnessed their stolen hour, now blessing their union. In the distance, a coyote called, wild and free. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of rain and new beginnings. Willow Creek had tested them with prejudice and violence, had nearly broken them with its rigid expectations and harsh judgments. But they'd emerged stronger, their love forged in the crucible of adversity. Now they were free to write their own story, to build a life limited only by the breadth of their dreams and the strength of their devotion. 5 years had passed since that moonlit night when two lonely souls had shared one forbidden hour. The high desert of New Mexico stretched endlessly before them, painted gold by the setting sun as Sam and Margaret Morrison stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching their horses graze in the meadow below. Sam had served as AU Marshal for 3 years in Santa Fe, earning a reputation for fairness and courage that echoed through the territory. But when Margaret told him she was finally with child after years of hoping, he'd made the choice to resign. The badge that had defined him for so long now rested in a drawer, replaced by the simpler satisfactions of raising horses and building a life with a woman he loved. Papa, Papa. 3-year-old Thomas came running across the yard, his dark hair, so like his father's, flying in the breeze. The mayor had her baby. Come see. Sam scooped up his son, settling him on his shoulders. Did she now? Well, we'd better go check on them. Margaret followed more slowly, her hand resting on her rounded belly where their second child grew. The doctor said, another month, maybe less. She paused to look back at their home, not grand but solid and welcoming. With windows facing east to catch the sunrise, just as Sam had once promised in a dream shared during darker days, the ranch sprawled across 50 acres of good grazing land, purchased with their combined savings and a loan from Marshall Hartley, who had become a close friend. They raised horses for the army and local ranchers. With Sam's eye for quality horse flesh and Margaret's head for business, making them successful enough to hire 2 hands and still put money aside. In the barn they found the new FO, still wobbly on stick legs, but already showing the strong lines that would make it valuable. Thomas watched with wide eyes as the FO nursed, asking a stream of questions that Sam answered patiently. Will it be fast like Shadow? The boy asked, referring to Sam's black stallion, now getting on in years but still magnificent. Maybe faster, Sam said. Your mama thinks this one will be special. Margaret smiled, remembering, your father always did have a gift for finding hidden treasures. Their eyes met over their son's head, sharing a moment of perfect understanding. The journey from that first meeting in Willow Creek to this peaceful evening had been filled with challenges. The adjustment to Santa Fe, the dangerous years of Sam's marshal work, the heartbreak of 2 lost pregnancies before Thomas arrived. But they'd faced it all together. Their bond growing stronger with each trial overcome. The sound of approaching horses drew them outside. Deputy Chin, now Sheriff Chin of Willow Creek, dismounted with a smile, accompanied by his new bride. The former Miss Catherine Walsh, the mayor's daughter. James, Margaret exclaimed with delight. And Catherine, what brings you all this way? Can't old friends visit? Chin replied, accepting Sam's firm handshake. Besides, we have news. The town council asked me to deliver this. He handed Sam an official-looking document. Sam read it, his eyebrows rising, then passed it to Margaret. It was a formal commendation from Willow Creek, honoring their service to the town and naming the new school building the Morrison School in their honor. They wanted you to know you're not forgotten, Catherine said softly. My father especially wanted to make amends for how things were. The town's different now, more accepting. The barriers between the Mexican Quarter and the main town are mostly gone. People remember how we all stood together. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. That's wonderful. Thank you for bringing this. They invited their guests to stay for supper, and soon the house filled with laughter and the smell of Margaret's much improved cooking. As they ate, Chin reeled them with stories of Willow Creek's growth. The railroad had come through, bringing prosperity and new challenges. The silver dollar had been replaced by a respectable hotel, and there was even talk of incorporating as a proper city. Do you ever miss it? Chin asked Sam as they stood on the porch after dinner, watching the stars emerge. The badge, the authority, the excitement. Sam considered the question, looking through the window to where Margaret sat by the fire, Thomas on her lap as she read him a story. Sometimes, he admitted, on quiet mornings, I remember the weight of the star, the purpose it gave me. But then I look at what I have now. Margaret, Thomas, this life we've built, and I know I made the right choice. You could always come back, Chin offered. The territorial governor mentioned they need good men for the new state police force they're forming. I'm honored, Sam said. But my marshalling days are done. I found my peace. James right here. Later that night, after their guests had retired, Sam and Margaret lay in their bed, moonlight streaming through the window. It was the same silver light that had witnessed their forbidden hour years ago, now blessing their lawful union. Do you ever regret it? Margaret asked, echoing a question from long ago. Giving up the badge for this quiet life? Sam pulled her close, his hand gentle on her pregnant belly. Never. Though I do sometimes think about that night, about how different things might have been if we'd been braver sooner. Perhaps, Margaret said. But I think we needed that journey, the struggle, the separation, even the danger. It taught us the value of what we have. That forbidden hour gave us the strength to fight for this. A kick from the baby made them both smile. Strong one, Sam noted. Like the father, Margaret replied. And the mother too. I hope this child will need strength in this wild land. They'll have it, Sam assured her. Morrison's strength and Sullivan's stubbornness. Unbeatable combination. They lay quietly, listening to the night sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through cottonwoods, the settling of their house around them. It was a simple life they'd built, far from the drama of their courtship, but it was theirs. The next morning brought the controlled chaos of ranch life. Sam worked with the horses while Margaret managed the household and kept Thomas from getting into too much mischief. In the afternoon, their nearest neighbors, the Johnsons, stopped by to discuss sharing the cost of a new well. It was the sort of mundane interaction that would have been impossible in Willow Creek during those dark days of gossip and judgment. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in familiar shades of red and gold, Sam found Margaret in her garden. She'd insisted on planting it despite the challenging climate, and through patience and determination had coaxed life from the arid soil. Tomatoes climbed stakes, beans wound around poles, and herbs scented the air. Remember when you told me you burned biscuits and made terrible coffee? He asked, sampling a sun-warmed tomato. I've improved, she said with dignity, then laughed slightly. Thank goodness Maria agreed to come cook for us twice a week. You've improved at many things, Sam said, growing serious. You're not the same woman who stood alone against the world in Willow Creek. No, Margaret agreed. That woman was so afraid of judgment, of loss, of hoping for happiness. You changed that, Sam. You gave me courage to want more than mere survival. We gave each other courage, he corrected. I was just as lost in my way, hiding behind the badge, afraid to feel. You reminded me there was more to life than duty. Thomas came running to join them, chattering about the FO and the lizard he'd caught and released. They walked together toward the house. A family shaped by hardship but defined by love. The setting sun caught Margaret's wedding ring, the simple band Sam had placed on her finger that day in Willow Creek when the whole town had finally celebrated their union. That night, as they tucked Thomas into bed, he asked for the story of how his parents met. It had become a favorite, though they edited it carefully for young ears. Once upon a time, Margaret began, there was a lonely sheriff who helped a sad lady when some mean man bothered her, and they fell in love, Thomas interrupted, knowing the story well. Eventually, Sam said, ruffling his son's hair. It took them a while to figure it out, but they did, Margaret continued. And they got married and lived happily ever after. With me, Thomas added proudly. With you. His parents agreed in unison after their son fell asleep. Sam and Margaret returned to their porch, their evening ritual. The stars spread above them in a glittering tapestry, and the desert breathed its ancient rhythms around them. It's been quite a journey, Margaret said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "From that desperate widow to this, sometimes I can hardly believe it's real." "It's real," Sam assured her. "Every bit of it, the good and the bad, the struggles and the triumphs. We earned this happiness, Margaret, with courage and patience and a love stronger than all the prejudice Willow Creek could muster." A shooting star blazed across the sky. And Margaret made a wish, not for herself, for she had everything she'd ever dreamed of, but for her children, that they might know love as true as what she'd found. That they might have the courage to fight for their happiness as their parents had. "What are you thinking?" Sam asked. "About time," she said. "How that one forbidden hour led to a lifetime. How a moment of weakness became our greatest strength." "No regrets, only gratitude," Margaret said firmly. "For that night, for you, for this life we've built from the ashes of our loneliness." Sam kissed her temple, his arms secure around her. "I love you, Mrs. Morrison, today, tomorrow, always. And I love you, Mr. Morrison, for all the hours we have, forbidden or otherwise." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Inside, their son slept peacefully. Soon another child would join their family. The horses were secure in the barn. The house was strong around them, and love had transformed what began in secrecy into something celebrated and whole. The wild desert stretched endlessly beyond their small circle of light. Still dangerous, still untamed. But here in this place they'd made their own. Two hearts that had once beaten in lonely isolation, now beat as one. They'd risked everything for love and won a life worth living. And under the same moon that had witnessed their forbidden hour, they continued their journey together. Proof that sometimes the greatest treasures come from the courage to reach for what seems impossible. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Please leave a comment below to let us know. We'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Sam and Margaret's journey. What touched your heart the most? We can't wait to hear from you.